Tell the story. Hear the story. How do you learn something? I've learned in several ways. I've made mistakes enough times, and then I've figured out how to avoid the mistakes. I've watched someone else do something and then copied what they did. I've read the instruction book. Really, I have. And followed directions. I've paid attention to a teacher as they taught. I've heard, I've seen, and remembered what my parents and others have taught me. And I have often, very often, heard and remembered story. Tonight's Maundy Thursday reading from 1 Corinthians 11, Paul tells the story. It's the story of Jesus at the Last Supper. He tells the story simply and concisely. He encourages the readers to do the same. Tell the story, hear the story, remember the story about how God created something good, how humanity is good at messing things up, about the experiences of struggling, confused, imperfect people in the Bible, and how God over and over again finds a way to bring restoration, reconciliation, and wholeness. About how God doesn't give up. About how Jesus reached out to, welcomed, and accepted the outcast, the exploited, the forgotten, and the rejected. About how God has, since the earliest of days, called us to love God and to love everyone. How Jesus taught in parables. There are so many parables. And then tonight, how Jesus shared a meal with his disciples. So Jesus celebrated Passover. There's no reason to think that he hadn't celebrated Passover every year of his life. This time, this year that we're talking about with Jesus, in many ways would be the same as it always had been. It was a celebration of deliverance and God's steadfast love. But this time, Jesus did a few things differently. He knew that the time of his death was near. So he took bread and he broke it. This time he gave the disciples the bread, and he didn't do things exactly the same as was customary. This time he told them that the bread was his body, given for them. This is my body given for you, he said. Do this in remembrance of me. Tell the story. Hear the story, remember the story. The Passover meal is about remembering, but it's also a celebration. There's lots to eat, lots to drink. And even though there are serious times during the meal, nothing during the meal is about impending death. It's a meal of remembrance and celebration. The Passover, at least the Passover from Jesus' time, the Passover that our brothers and sisters in Judaism celebrate now, looks different than what Jesus would have celebrated. The Passover that Jesus would have celebrated is a lot more like communion. So when we want to experience what Jesus did at Passover, we celebrate communion. If you want to experience a Seder meal, a Passover meal with people who are Jewish, then we go to a synagogue, or we at least invite a rabbi. If you ever want to experience that, I'm sure you have friends who would invite you to a Shabbat service or something like that. I don't usually recommend, though, that Christian churches try to do Seder meals, because it really isn't part of our tradition. What we do is communion. And in temples, they don't do communion, they do Passover and Shabbat. Tell the story, hear the story. Remember the story. The body thing, when Jesus talked about that, That probably threw the disciples a little bit, but they ate and began to understand, if only a little. After dinner, and after at least 3 glasses of wine, Jesus did something different again. We don't know for certain from the Bible, but it's reasonable to think that Jesus may have taken the 4th cup of wine, the one called the cup of Elijah, the cup that is the one that awaits Elijah's return. Jesus had said that John was Elijah, and so taking the cup of Elijah would make sense. But then Jesus, before offering it to his disciples, said that this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. And again, the disciples didn't quite get this death talk during the meal of celebration, but they drank and understood maybe a little. Tonight I'm telling this story. Tonight we're hearing this story. I hope we'll remember the story. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread. After giving thanks, he broke the bread, gave it to his disciples, and said, "Take this, all of you, and eat it. This is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup of wine and gave thanks, and then he gave it to them and said, "This is a cup of my blood in the new covenant. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." And the Apostle Paul, in tonight's reading, the Apostle Paul tells us that as often as we eat the bread and drink of the cup, we proclaim his death. And I add, we proclaim his resurrection, because that's just around the corner, until Christ returns. When's that? I don't know. Nobody does. Soon we'll become part of this story. Soon, together, we'll share a meal. Amen.